Hey everybody, we're going to get started. I'm Emma and I'm here with Laura tonight. Tonight's topic is archival arrangement and description. In this webinar, we're really going to focus on project management and how to lay everything out for success before you start the arrangement and description process. So just a couple pieces of housekeeping. We are going to hold for a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, just please wait till the very end. We also ask that you only raise your hand for questions and not comments. Any information you want to add, if you'll wait till we have the video posted on YouTube, because then you can put it in the comments, and we'll also have some links to resources in the description of that video. So again, we are recording, and I will email it out to everybody later this week who registered. So even if somebody registered and didn't make it, they will get that email. And then please just stay muted. We do have like 80 people in the room tonight. Okay, so Backlog is my company. We're an archival consulting firm, and we really help with digitization and to bring collections online. Sorry, the little blue thing is me letting people into the room. So we do genealogy research, but we also do like archival consulting. And the biggest thing that we do with that is archival needs assessments. So going in, creating a roadmap, explaining what good next steps are, especially for places with volunteers. And then we also do policy writing and digitization plans. And I'm Emma. I founded Backlog in 2021 after being laid off during the pandemic. Yeah, and again, we work with smaller places to bring their collections online. And from here, I'm going to hand it off to Laura.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Emma. My name is Laura Weiss, and like Emma said, I am a full-time employee with Backlog, and my current project working with Backlog is that I'm working at the Bernard Becker Medical Library at Washington University, doing a couple of projects, processing projects that are related to our topic for this evening. So just to get started, I'll do a brief overview here. And like Emma said, I just wanted to quickly note that I'll be talking, and we'll all be talking in a little bit less detail about kind of the nitty-gritty of the actual work of arrangement and description, and more about how you might approach developing a plan to do that work. So what might some of those components of a plan be? What kind of questions could you be asking along the way? How you might try to estimate the time required for certain stages or certain tasks. And then I'll just try to provide a few examples from my own experience over the last few years. And we will include some resources with the video once it's posted that will go into more depth on the actual process of processing, so to speak. So if that's something that is also of interest, so making determinations about levels of arrangement, description, things like that. And actually for description, there's a Backlog webinar that you can check out as well on Finding 8 Basics, which goes into greater depth on things like descriptive standards. So all of that being said, just a quick kind of roadmap for the rest of the webinar. First, I'm going to go through a couple of definitions just to make sure we're all sort of on the same page. And then I'll talk a little bit more in depth about some ideas for creating a work plan and why it's an important thing. And then I'll talk about some examples. And then hopefully we have some time for questions at the end as well. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So first, before delving into creating a work plan, thinking about some definitions, I think it's important to note, as many of you probably already know, all of these terms are really interrelated. And as ever, when we're talking about archives, we're always kind of looking towards that goal, or things are pointing us towards the goal of making materials accessible for patrons to use. So these definitions are drawn from the Society of American Archivists, and also with some content from Dennis Meissner, who's written extensively about arrangement and description. So processing, just a kind of a basic definition, would be simply preparing materials for archival use. Another way to think about it is the arrangement, description, and housing or storage of our archival materials so that they can be used by patrons. So processing, can think about it maybe as a little bit of a broader term that encompasses all of those steps that an archivist will take to facilitate access and use. I think sometimes we hear processing and arrangement and description used a little bit interchangeably. But I think it can also be helpful to note that processing can be understood to include additional steps like preservation activities, conservation treatments, those kinds of things, in addition to arrangement and description. Thinking about arrangement then, we can think of arrangement as the process of organizing, sequencing materials with respect to their provenance and original order. And arrangement encompasses both kind of an intellectual ordering and a physical ordering, which we can get into a little bit more when talking about the work plan. And as many of you probably are aware, traditionally those levels of arrangement are going to reflect a hierarchy, starting with the repository, record group or collection, series, sometimes sub-series, file, down to the item level. And then finally, thinking about description, again, in one sense, can kind of be straightforward. What materials does an archive have, and how can a patron find and use them? How do you communicate that? And then going in a little bit more detail, description really provides information about the scope of a collection, how it's structured, how its component pieces relate to one another. So not only the content, but the context of the materials within the collection. So who created them, when, for what reason, and that information is usually captured in a finding aid, a descriptive tool that's going to help researchers, patrons, archivists kind of locate, understand, and use those archival materials. All right, so we can move on to the next slide then. So to plan or not to plan, my spoiler alert, plan. It seems maybe obvious that you would want to try to at least have a sense of some steps that you're going to be taking or an order of operations going forward. But at least for me, I think sometimes putting a plan together when it seems like there are a lot of unknowns, as there often are with processing and just archives in general, it can be kind of daunting to think about. So I found it helpful to think about a work plan as a living document, as many other folks have said. It can help to order your steps, ensure you're kind of being consistent and thorough just in the way that you're approaching each project that you take on. So that being said, a plan is almost certainly not going to be a static document. It's going to evolve. You'll revise it as you go along, as you learn more about the collection and its contents. Depending on your situation, you might have due dates that you're trying to meet. But even I think within that context of a time frame or time constraints, it's still important to, if you have a supervisor or colleagues that you're working with, be in conversation with them. And just communicate about the process, because there are almost always, I think, unexpected findings and things that require you to adjust as you go along. So just a quick note then on archival workflows. Every archival institution is going to be different, but generally will follow a similar workflow. And you've probably seen this mapped out before: appraisal, acquisition, accession, kind of deciding what materials to acquire, establishing intellectual and physical control, taking those into the archive, and then the pieces we're talking about: arrangement, description, all the way through storage, preservation, finally access. So if you are looking online for a processing workflow and something like that comes up, it might look like it's kind of a straightforward process, like a diagram depicting something like that, but I'm sure, as many of you know, it's rarely linear. Some steps might be happening simultaneously. You might start to sort materials into categories at the same time as you're moving things into archival housing. So just, I think, being mindful that it's not always going to be a linear process is important to keep in mind. All of these clear archival principles guiding the work, but just not always a one-size-fits-all approach. And one thing I just really appreciate in another webinar that I had been part of, Samantha Thompson, who's an archivist for the region of Peel in Ontario, Canada, and I'm paraphrasing here a bit, but she was commenting that no matter how many years you've been working in an archive or working as an archivist, it's almost sometimes as if you are a beginner with each new collection that you are processing, arranging, and describing, simply because each collection is so different. So you're kind of learning, you're feeling your way through a little bit each and every time. So with all that said, that can bring us to creating a work plan on our next slide. All right. So what are some of the things that you can include in a work plan? And I should say up front, these kind of stages that I'm talking about are largely drawn from, again, from Dennis Meissner. You're probably maybe familiar with the book, Arranging and Describing Archives and Manuscripts, which is a Society of American Archivists publication. A lot of institutions have made processing manuals or plans available publicly online, and they also kind of tend to follow a similar trajectory, but each and every one also has its own kind of particularities that are unique to their institution, types of materials, those kinds of things. But just to say up front and give credit where it's due there, owe a lot to that book and helping to formulate some of these ideas. So setting expectations, if you do have a supervisor or if you're working with in collaboration with colleagues, I think just talking about expectations up front is something that I've found really helpful. Are you going to be working within time constraints? Is there an anniversary, for example, coming up, or an exhibit where a collection might need to be accessible at that time, or if at least would be ideal if it was something that was accessible at that time. Another question you might think through is, has direction been given on what level of processing to do? Is that clear? If this particular collection warrants just kind of a more minimal level, where, you know, is the goal kind of going to be series level descriptions, or is it going to be something that's a little more intensive, maybe folder level or even item level descriptions. So all of those things will factor in to both how you approach the work and especially if you're thinking about how long something might take, budgeting that time. Level of description or level of processing might be a component to consider there. And again, some organizations may already have detailed processing manuals with certain criteria that are laid out on how best to kind of tackle those questions, how to track that information, while others might be more of kind of an organic process that's going to emerge in conversation over time. And then all of these things, again, are going to be interrelated, but reviewing any existing documentation. So talk with people, again, if they're present in your office, people who might be familiar with the collection already, folks who maybe have worked there for some time, have institutional memory, like, oh, I remember when this came in and this is what happened, and those kinds of questions. Does an inventory already exist, or do you need to create one? Is it complete? Is it partial? Is it inventory donor created, or is it something that an archivist created upon accession? Has somebody already surveyed this collection in the past? Did they take notes on it? So just trying to get a sense of how much a particular processing project has already perhaps had done with it or not done with it. And all of those things, you know, for example, the existence of an inventory already might impact how you budget your time going forward. And then background research. Again, who is the creator, or who are the creators? Even before you really start delving into the materials, can you be aware of, or are you already aware of what kinds of activities or significant events occurred that resulted in the records? Are you aware of any relationships between individuals and organizations? Kind of like a mind map of relationships or structures, maybe creating a timeline of a creator's life or an institution if it underwent changes over time. One thing that in the current project that I'm working on, a colleague had shared with me a list of acronyms that were related to a particular institute and a lot of the scientific terms that were associated with that. And that ended up being really helpful both as a starting point and then something to kind of build on as I went through the collection more in depth. So especially if you know you're going to be working with materials that maybe are more of an unfamiliar topic, just making sure to take time to familiarize yourself with things and familiarizing yourself with things and knowing though that knowledge is going to continue to build over time. You can't know everything from the very beginning. So some good sources for doing that type of early research, early background research might be publications that are written either about or by the creator. Are there any institutional histories or reports that you can take a look at? Maybe the creator has written a memoir. They've done an oral history. What types of predecessors for the institution exist? Are there histories of those? I think obituaries can provide a lot of good information. And then something that I also found helpful just recently in my experience was perusing any related collections at your institution as well. So are there already existing record groups or collections that might be related to what you're going to be delving into? So all of that might take some time and important to account for that as you think about your plan. But I do think, and I'm sure many of you think it is worth it. And again, interrelated, having that understanding of expectations also helps you in deciding how much time to dedicate to things like background research. And it can also be happening simultaneously as you start to survey the collection, which can bring us to our next slide. So thinking about surveying the collection is kind of a stage for the work plan. The goal here is to get an overview of what's there. So you're going to be reviewing the contents, often by container, and then creating that initial inventory if it doesn't already exist. Taking all kinds of notes. What kinds of materials are you noticing? Does it seem like it's going to be mostly paper documents? Are there photographic materials, video, anything, artifacts that might require special storage? And then maybe as you're going through, noting any potential arrangement structures. You might create kind of little Post-it notes, thinking about where you're starting to see any relationships between materials emerge. Or are you noticing perhaps that, oh boy, this is a box of completely loose documents, and I'm going to need to take some more time to figure out exactly how they might all relate to one another. And then we can go to our next slide. And then kind of our next stage would be thinking about arrangement and kind of thinking in those two different components. Again, often things will be happening simultaneously, or you can at least be thinking about them simultaneously, but an intellectual arrangement or order is going to, whenever possible, reflect the creator's structure or order of materials. And sometimes that's going to be really clear from when you did that survey, and it's going to require maybe little time and labor on your part to develop that arrangement structure. But other times you may be taking a little more time to try to restore or recreate original order to the best of your ability. So it's always going to depend on the collection. And some of those resources that we'll include later can go into more detail on how you might really get into making those determinations. For our purposes, just hoping to convey that in terms of a work plan, this is a stage where you'll be analyzing that initial inventory, identifying probable series, sequencing of materials. And then as you're creating a plan, if you're including time estimates, trying to lay out a time frame for your work, knowing whether an arrangement is fairly evident or whether you'll need to take more time to recreate that arrangement is going to be a factor in how much time you budget. And then as you propose and finalize an intellectual arrangement scheme, maybe you've got correspondence series, publications series, professional series with sub-series. You can proceed then to physical arrangement, which is what it sounds like. You're physically putting materials into storage containers in a particular order. And again, some of these elements may have been happening already to some extent. You may have already removed documents from binders, place them in archival folders as you were doing that initial survey. But generally, we're talking here about putting the materials in their physical order and placing them in archivally safe housing and ultimately labeling folders and boxes, probably first with temporary labels, then permanent labels. And then simultaneously putting together that container list, including descriptive information that will ultimately form the basis of your finding aid. So again, there are some resources that go into more detail about how you might proceed with the actual acts of physical arrangement. Hierarchically is, I think, a common way, kind of going one level at a time. But our point here is just thinking about how much sorting you're going to be doing is going to impact how much time to budget for this stage in your work plan. Right, and next slide. And then finally thinking about description. The description process is most often will already have begun during the arrangement process. But just reiterating that, making sure that you're recording information that will be used in DACS compliant fields, for example. Make sure making a work plan that you're really budgeting time to review, I think. Just review, make sure that all of the information is included in those fields. Depending on the institution, you might be uploading information then to a web-based application like Archive Space or Access to Memory. So this, again, can be a piece that's actually happening simultaneously with arrangement, but thinking about all of the components involved as you create a plan can also be helpful. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of templates out there. And I think, as I said, a lot of institutions have made manuals accessible, and those can also serve as great resources. You might have documents already that are tracking your progress. But with all of that said, this was something that I had put together based on those stages that were outlined by Meissner. And then kind of adapting it here and there as much as possible to my own needs. So for instance, knowing that I was going to be working within a constrained time period with an objective to process 2 collections, trying to visualize it this way with those kind of start dates, target end date, actual end date, helping me to get a sense of, okay, this is how long I thought that was going to take, but it took this long. And I think, even though these are separated out into intellectual arrangement, physical arrangement, description, some of those things that might overlap, you can visualize it this way and actually have the dates overlap as well. And so you can visualize that overlapping and not necessarily thinking about it as one step after the other in all cases. So some things are just, I think, going to require a best guess on how long they will take, which is why it's important to emphasize again that timelines might be revised. But you can always do your best to estimate and make sure to just give yourself ample time, I think, to revise a plan going forward. So thinking about this then and some examples. One example just in my recent experience would be with a more recently acquired faculty collection. So this would be papers of a faculty member with kind of a significant history, papers acquired relatively recently in one accession. And when I began working on the project, an initial inventory had already been compiled. So of course that was immensely useful and became a great resource. At the same time, I did also still do my own kind of survey and overview so that I could also become familiar with the materials, but had that initial inventory as something that I could use as a guide. I did also, thinking about some of that background research, I read the creator's memoir. Unfortunately, he had also done an oral history, so listened to that. Didn't read that all in one sitting. So again, there's always going to be some overlap. But tried to do maybe a chapter a day as I was also going through that initial survey of the collection, and starting to see things. Oh, he's talking about this, and I see that here in the collection. So that ended up being really useful as well. And then when it comes to, or when it came to estimating how long it might take to arrange and describe, I noted during that survey that many of the materials, not every last one, but many were already organized into fairly identifiable groupings by the donor, and that those seemed like they were going to translate pretty well into series or subseries. And then when that wasn't the case, making sure to note it, knowing I'd have to spend a little more time on those portions with how I might pursue arranging those materials. And then another thing that factored into thinking about a time frame was noticing that almost all of the folders that had been included, that I was most likely going to be able to retain original folder titles. There weren't a whole lot of loose documents. So something like that could perhaps go into how much time you budget for arrangement. So since I didn't have to determine a lot of new titles, it made refoldering a little bit more straightforward. And then thinking about another example that ended up being a little bit different. This one was more institutional records, a record group with multiple accessions over a longer period of time. And delving into that, there had already been some work done on it, some inventory for some parts of the collection, but maybe not for others. Noticing that in some cases, an order would need to kind of be imposed or created as best we could. Because it was records of an entity that was part of the university, there were a lot of already a substantial amount of information available in reports and other publications. So that really helped with background research. And thinking through one particular portion of that collection where the files were not necessarily clearly organized in an identifiable order, a number of loose documents, documents that were contained in unlabeled folders. So as I'm putting together more of a time frame for this particular project, knowing that I was going to need to spend a little bit more time rather than just being able to retain original folder titles in that instance. And then just one area as an example where I did have to adjust this particular timeline was discovering that a lot of photographs in this particular collection seemed to have corresponding negatives that were in a different collection. And that was one that I had happened to kind of peruse as I was trying to become more familiar with the work that I was going to be doing. So again, having those conversations with colleagues or supervisors, ended up spending some additional time that I hadn't initially budgeted, recording where those photographs had corresponding negatives, the locations, so that that information could be included in a final description and hopefully be useful to folks who are hoping to use those materials. So I get just if I had to summarize, have a plan, but be prepared to be flexible, and give yourself some grace. You're going to need revising throughout. And again, not having to hopefully go through it entirely alone. You can always be doing these things in conversation with folks. And there are lots and lots and lots of resources available as well.
Great, thank you, Laura. So really quickly, the name of our company's Backlog, that's my email address. Our next webinar is on email archiving. That's on Monday, November 18th. And if you go to our YouTube page, we have a bunch of videos on different archival topics, including one on finding aids. Yeah, so if anybody has a question, feel free to unmute or to raise your hand. We don't have a chat tonight. I just asked that if you have a comment that you save it for the YouTube comments, because that way if you have links or things to share, other people can see them.
Hi, I'm Molly Shannon. Great webinar, very useful. I think I have a lot of questions that in my institutional setting, I have a lot of materials where original order is rarely retained because they're religious records, and so you have a lot of committees or turnover of pastors, so that kind of affects that. So I'm curious what you do with institutions, because I usually find myself imposing an order based on the structure of the church. You know, and I think you would do the same for other institutional records, but I haven't worked with as many. I did used to be a university archivist, but we didn't have as many department records as we would have, you know, liked.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind for me would be if I did find myself in that situation, I'm sure this is what you're doing, would be making sure to include a processing note that is the decision that was made, why it was made. That I know that's something that I had done in a couple of instances where it just wasn't, an original order just wasn't clear. So if that order was imposed, making sure to note that, you know, maybe if you know this is how that particular group of materials was received, or it was grouped together, and the decision was made by the archivist to keep them together or to arrange them in this particular way.
I don't think that's been explicitly stated before, but it's just kind of but that is an interesting question, an interesting topic to pursue. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you know, that I think every archivist is going to approach that question differently as well. So again, some of those resources that are included, hopefully with the video, are going to go into more depth about how you can think through, I think, that question in particular. What types of other questions you might be able to ask, and then making sure to record, just kind of recording your decision-making process on that. But yeah, again, I think every archivist is probably going to have a different answer or a different approach to those questions based on the types of records, like you said, that you're working with.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I had a question, pardon me. I was curious about your process is for keeping track of your process, if that makes sense, just as an archivist. And I'm an archivist. I'm actually glancing over and looking at my archives because I keep things, I work from home, and that's where the archives are for my organization. And I've done a lot of digitizing and that sort of thing, but just sort of thinking ahead to the future when somebody else might be in charge of these archives, you know, what would be the process for letting people know just, you know, how you ordered things or what there was, especially, you know, in a case like mine where I didn't follow, like I'm not trained, or I wasn't originally trained, so I don't have, like, you use a lot of lingo that I didn't recognize, although you described a process that was incredibly familiar to me. I think I sort of made it up as I went along, and I got there, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, great question. I might have to think about that one for a little bit. I can just speak from my own experience, has been working more on kind of discrete projects. So not necessarily, having to manage, entire or multiple different collections or communicating that for the future. But for myself, it's a lot of spreadsheets. I think is a big part of it. I'd be happy to maybe be in touch or something, with a little bit more detail on that.
And that's really where your finding aid comes in handy, kind of like the answer to Molly's question, like this is why we chose this, and this is, like kind of where we came from when we, like chose this order. And that's just like a really good place to add a lot of those intellectual notes.
So kind of just like a Word document, it sounds like.
Yeah, and we actually have a webinar on finding aids, and it kind of breaks down kind of what they look like and what information's in them. And so those are your
I hear that term used a lot, but I can't really picture it.
Yeah, so
like I don't really know what it looks like or how to envision kind of, yeah. I mean, I have a sense of it digitally, but I don't know.
So the thing with finding aids is that it always sounds like very like casual or colloquial, but it's like actually a standard term.
Right.
So I've seen like volunteers like, oh, this is my finding aid. It's a map of the archives. And so if you Google like archival standards, finding aids, it'll give you like a little bit more direction.
Great.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and joining Laura and I. And then we recorded the webinar and I will send it out to everybody later this week. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.